Hello again, everyone. It is now March, and I got my um, new bench pillow kit from the Blake Designs, and got it a couple days into March, and started cutting things out, working on it, and then of course, kids things came up, and no matter how long you've been quilting, sometimes you get frustrated with projects, and I got a little frustrated with this one, and I'll explain why in a minute. It really hasn't been too bad, but sometimes things just irritate you, so you put them aside for a few days and go about your business, and then come back to it. We also had some beautiful weather into the 70s, so I was working on garden and planting a few flowers and things like that, and getting outside while I could. Today is a little wet and drizzly, rainy here, so I am back in my sewing room and getting things going again. So I have the Bring May Flowers uh, bench pillow kit by Riley Blake Designs, and comes in a cute little box, got all my fabrics. I will say with this one, they did not give a whole lot of extra on a few fabrics, and I'll explain that in a minute. So we've got these cute little flowers with these cute little pinwheels in between. So it's actually a fairly simple design, especially compared to what the last one was with all those little teeny tiny pieces. We don't have those teeny tiny pieces, but there are a lot of triangles. So I'm going to kind of go over what I did and some options for you to get those triangles to not be wonky. So on the cutting instructions, everything looked pretty good. There wasn't anything really missing or anything like that that I could tell. One thing that I did instead, however, was I oversized a few things so that when I did the stitch and flip method, I would have a little bit extra and I could trim up. Now, with that being said, when I got into cutting a few things, the pink, green, and the light blue Songbird Sparkler, I didn't have enough to make them as big as what I had intended to begin with. I tried to oversize by 1/4 of an inch. Really need to cut that back to 1/8 of an inch. It will still work. It will still give you a little bit of extra, but I had to cut those back a little bit, and readjust, which was fine. So the honey pin dot, the only thing I changed was the 2.5 inch squares, making them, I actually made all of those 2 3/4, and I think that will work for you, and I'll explain that in a minute. The peacock blossom, I cut of that blue, instead of the 3 or 4 strips, 2.5 inches, I cut 2.5 inch strips, but one of the strips I increased to 2 3/4. And I did that for the flying geese to match that. I would change that to 2 5/8. And honestly, I would change all of those strips to 2 5/8. That way, when you put your strips together with your triangles, you have a little bit of leeway and you can trim those down just in case it's a little bit off. Now, a lot of people don't want to do the trimming down because it takes extra time, things like that. But really, if you oversize just a touch with those triangles and trim down, you actually save time versus ripping out and restitching. And you do have enough of that blue, that peacock blossom, to be able to do 2 5/8 inch strips for all of those. That's really only going to add an extra 1/2 inch, and you've got plenty even doing the binding for that. If it is a little bit short, you can actually do a 2 1/4 inch binding strip, and that works pretty well. If you do that true 1/4 inch seam with the folded binding, it's going to go on just fine. And you actually won't have as much just flat negative space in your binding if you do a 2¼ inch binding versus the 2½ inch. So that gives you a little bit of playroom with that peacock blossom. Do what works for you. You may want to play around with it a little bit, cut one strip a little bit bigger, see if you can make it work. You know, or if you're really good at those seams, if you are, you know, just a perfect stitcher, then you can get away with what it says in doing a 2½ inch and not worry about it. On the yellow, the same thing, instead of 2½, for those rectangles, the 2½ by 4½, I actually went to 2¾ by 4¾ and I had plenty of the yellow in which to oversize those each by 1/4 inch. Now, if you do your blue and your pink at 2 5/8, I would also do the yellow at 2 5/8 just to make that match. It'll make it a little bit easier to do those flying geese. You can have them mismatch like that, and I'll walk you through that, but it is easier if they match. So go 2 5/8 by 4 3/4 on those, and that's going to give you, you're going to trim up those flying geese, so that just gives you a little bit of wiggle room so they're nice and perfect for you. The peas, go ahead and cut them as it says, the 3-inch squares. They've already oversized those to be able to trim those up. The lipstick blossom, do the 8 instead of 2½ square inch, we're gonna do 2 5/8. I tried to do 2 3/4 and I did not have enough. So then I backed it down to 2 5/8. Luckily I had enough, you know, I noticed that. And so my last few, I cut down, I cut at 2 5/8 and then cut the other ones back. The Songbird Sparkler, same thing. I didn't have enough. And when I had cut the pink, then I looked at the Songbird Sparkler and looked and said, oh, I don't have enough to do the 2 3/4. So I did the 2 5/8 instead. And I'm oversizing those so that when I stitch and flip, I have a little bit of extra leeway so that I can trim those up and they're not pulling and being wonky. On the instructions, everything is looking good on these instructions. If you watched my videos last month for the Easter one, it had the pinwheel, and I talked about spinning that seam and making that pinwheel on the back. It actually talks about that here, and you're going to do it twice. So the first one is pretty easy. So you're going to stitch the A pieces together. So you've got your P and your honey dot on my, and they're both labeled A. On my honey dot, you can see I have made marks. 1/4 inch seam ruler. You can get these from several different brands. Works really well to be able to put on your square corner to corner and be able to make those marks. They say, oh, we'll just make a line down the center and go 1/4 inch to either side. This, I feel like, gives me a little bit more precise when I'm doing both of these. You can use it to make a mark corner to corner, but there's really no reason to if you have that 1/4 inch either side of this. And then when you put it with your P color and put it on there, I'm going to stitch down these lines. Now, I always stitch a little bit to the inside of that to make sure that it really is that 1/4 inch, because your pen is wider, and so it doesn't get right along that line. So if I go just inside that a scant amount, then I'm going to have that scant 1/4 inch seam, and then it gives me enough to trim off for those triangles. So I'm going to do that on all of those. And then once you have those sewn, you're going to cut it down the middle, corner to corner, and you're going to end up with triangles like this. I have this nifty-difty 2½ inch triangle that is perfect for cutting these squares. So much of the triangles that we do are 2.5-inch squares. That is just kind of standard practice. And so this works really well to be able to put on here and be able to trim that up. You can see there's a dotted line right here that says 2.5. That's what's going to go on my stitches. And then you can see I've got a little bit that I'm going to trim off. And then it also gives me my nice corners, clipped corners, so that when I iron that out, they are not gonna, you're not gonna see those little corners, and you're not gonna have those sticking out. You don't have to cut those off, but you're gonna cut them off later anyway. So nice and perfect 2.5-inch square. Now those are all gonna get ironed towards the green. That way you don't have shadowing on that white. Then when you stitch all those together in your pinwheel pattern, number one, when you do that, and I put these starting in my pinwheel and I lay these over, because I've laid them both to the green, that snuggles really well, okay? If you can see that, those seams snuggle right there, so you can stitch down and they're not gonna move and wiggle around on you. If you've got them going the same direction, they're gonna wiggle around and not line up very well for you. So this is my finished pinwheel, okay? And I've got the square blocks on the side, but you can see on the back that I also have a little pinwheel on the back, and everything is going in a circle, okay? And that, these two actually got flipped a little bit, but that's okay because they're going towards the green, and it creates this nice little pinwheel in the middle, just like the instructions say. And so when I ironed this last seam, then I just pop a few of those stitches, make those go opposite directions, and then that is going to create your pinwheel. Okay. So that's the pinwheel. It goes pretty easily. It's a pretty simple thing, especially if you iron the correct way. And their instructions are pretty good for that. Again, my final seams, I made them go towards the green instead of the white, having them go the same direction, but the pinwheel's gonna pop either way, and that's okay. It's still gonna lay really flat, and you're not gonna have this big bulky seam in the middle. All right, on to the flower block. So you've got your longer rectangles, and you're adding squares that then become triangles to your corners. So you can see I've already got one attached. So I oversized these squares, and I actually oversized these 1/4 inch. I did not oversize my rectangles, which is fine. The reason I was getting frustrated is that even though I had oversized these triangles, they still weren't coming out, and I wasn't having anything to trim off. So I actually played with a few different ways to do this. So you can do the stitch and flip method, and if you have them the exact same size, you just put it on corner to corner, stitch and flip. If I do it like this and I have it oversized, I'm gonna have stuff to trim off on the top. I'm not gonna have anything to trim off on this edge. You can, if you're very careful, move it over so that you do have some overhang on this side and kind of split the difference, as long as your mark down the center matches your corner on your rectangle. Stitch it again, going just a scant inside that line towards the corner, so that when you flip, you have that seam, and then it should come out to where you trim it up. Mine, for whatever reason this time, decided not to work well. So that's why I kind of put it aside, came back to it. The other way that you can do this, and you can see I haven't trimmed this up yet because I wanted to show you the other way that you can do this is there is this folded corners ruler that has come out. And you can do flying geese with this. You can do the pinwheels with this. You can do this type of thing with it. And it's got really good instructions with it. And it gives you different ways to do this. You can have them perfectly lined up, the same size that you need. You can have them oversized and flip. So you can do it a couple of different ways. The only thing I would caution you with on this is that once you cut this corner, the way that their instructions are, you then have a bias. And so you want to make sure that you are not stretching that at all. Otherwise, it's going to become wonky again. But what you do is you take your ruler, and instead of marking this line, I'm going to line up the ruler so that this line here is corner to corner. And then it creates that 1/4 inch seam allowance for you. See if I can get you a better view of that. Okay. So then I can cut this edge off and I have this ready to go. Then on this rectangle, I'm going to do the same thing, but I don't know where this is, but I'm going to line this up so that you get that 1/4 inch. I've got it lined up on this edge. I'm creating this 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to trim that up. Now, if you did oversize your rectangles a little bit on this, make sure that your length is correct to do it this way, especially on these. These are the ones that are going to be very important that you do have the correct length to begin with, not oversized, because you want to make sure that those triangles are correct. Now, I can lay this triangle on here, and it doesn't really matter if I'm oversized or not. I'm going to lay it on there. If it's not oversized, it's going to line up perfectly on both ends, but because this is oversized, I'm just going to split the difference. And I'm going to lay it on there so that then when I stitch that, that's going to come over. It's going to be oversized just a little bit. I can come in with a ruler and I'm going to trim that up. You can even use that particular folded corners ruler to trim up, but really what this is designed for is to cut those corners off so that you have that. But again, now you have a bias. You don't want to stretch that at all when you're messing with it or when you're stitching it. You don't want to pull on that. And the less, cut it right before you're ready to sew it. The less you handle it, the less you're going to have of that stretch. If you can not cut until you're ready to stitch, that is going to give you the best results. Okay, so here is one that I have sewn on and I have not trimmed it up yet. So this is going to be 2.5 by 6.5. And so you can do it a couple of different ways. For this one, it's going to be pretty simple. I want to make sure that my 2.5 line is on the bottom of my triangle. And then I actually want, this is a 6.5 inch square ruler, so that actually works out pretty well. I want to make sure that those points come clear to those edges of that. And then you can see I've got extra all the way around on my triangles. And I'm going to trim that up so I get this nice, perfect rectangle. And then when I go to do my corners and I sew this together, I'm going to get a nice pretty point on that. Okay. You can use, if you have a flying geese, you can check those angles and make sure that that's where you want it, and then trim up those edges. But you got to make sure that it's 6.5. I don't have a flying geese that's the right width for this, so that doesn't really work for me. So that's why I'm using another one. If we look at the next one that we're doing, which is the blue with the blue, I can actually, so same method to do it, stitch and flip. This one I have not trimmed up yet. Again, if you put it on just in the traditional method, okay, you can see I've got a little bit oversized here. If I put it on in the traditional method, flip it over, iron it nice and crisp, then I can use an add a quarter ruler to be able to get that nice 1/4 inch seam. And because you have ironed this over, it creates a little bit of a hump. And so that add a quarter ruler sits really nicely against that seam. So then I can just trim that up. Make sure on these guys that you are putting them on the correct corner before you trim them up, or if you're using that simple folded corner, make sure you're cutting off the correct corner on this rectangle. That's going to be really important, because otherwise you're going to run out of this blue, and with that mistake. The triangle could be reused and put on a different corner, but then you're kind of out of luck on that blue rectangle. So I'm actually going to use my flying geese ruler to trim this up, because even though I don't have a triangle on this side, it is the correct size that I need for this particular block. And so what you want to do is, you can see on here, I have this pink line. These are what I'm using. This line here is going to go along my seam that I created with my triangle. And then the bottom one is going to go along the bottom. And because I had my rectangle exactly right, I really don't have anything along here, but I've got a little bit of that triangle up top that I'm going to trim off. And so that works really nicely to be able to get that trimmed up nice and have this nice corner. If you did oversize this triangle and have it over a little bit more, you may have some on that side to trim, and then that'll get your angle in just the right place using that flying geese ruler. Okay. All right. Then you have basically the same thing, but with a white. Okay, so you're going to do the same exact methods that you were doing. You can see this one gave me some fits, didn't line up quite right, but because I'm trimming off, that's not going to matter. I used the traditional stitch and flip on this one. I'm going to use my add a quarter to trim that guy up, and then I will use my flying geese. Again, now because this one is flipped, this line is going to go right along that seam for between the white and the blue. And I actually do have a little bit extra on this side. So I'm going to just trim up that triangle. And then nice and perfect. It's not wonky. I don't have a little wonky seam, so that when I lay that out, it's going to be nice and perfect and lay nice with the next one. All right, the next block is the flying geese. So you've got yellow, blue, and pink. We want to make sure that on this one that we get the colors on the correct side. Okay, So again, I'm gonna make lines from corner to corner on my squares, not on my rectangle. So first one I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put the blue on first. And so it's gonna lay on that rectangle, and I'm gonna go corner to corner. There are other ways of doing flying geese. If you've done the Eleanor Burns method or anything like that. However, with this one, it doesn't work to do Eleanor Burns method because number one, they didn't give you the right size of piece to be able to do that. And number two, you end up with two opposite. So you get 4 flying geese out of each one, but they would be opposite colors. So I would end up with 2 correct and then 2 that are blue over here and pink over here. And so that does not work for this particular pattern because they're all the same. So we have to do it in a more traditional method. However, I am oversizing them so that I can get rid of that wonkiness and trim them up true and perfect. So I'm going to put that blue one on first, and I'm going to get this. Okay. So now I've got my blue one on. This is kind of like cooking shows, and they do this and then they magically have the next thing already ready. So I'm going to trim that up using that add a quarter ruler. And then my pink one goes on. And you can see there is overlap here between the pink and the blue. We want that because that's going to give us our 1/4 inch seam so that that yellow point is perfect when you go to put it on. So then I have this and I have it lined up just like that. So then I'm going to iron it open. Okay. Trim it up with that add a quarter ruler. Flip it open. Okay. And you can see even just on my mat here that it's not quite perfect. It's a little wonky. Okay. So that's why we oversized it, and we're going to use our flying geese ruler to do it. There's different sizes of these, so make sure that you've got the correct size. I want my overall piece to be 2.5 by 4.5 inches. That allows my 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side. So the flying geese ruler says 2 by 4 finished geese. So in your piece, they're going to be 2 by 4. So that's what we want. This adds in those seam allowances. So when I put this on here, I want to make sure that these 45-degree lines match up with my seams. And so that's where I'm going to put it. And you can see that I have a little bit extra all the way around. So it gives that 1/4 inch here, which is my seam allowance, so that when I sew it to the next piece, that point is going to be perfect at that seam. So this one lines up just right. If yours doesn't line up just perfectly, that's okay. Just split the difference. Okay. So if you have one, let's take a look at this one and see if it's any different. Because sometimes they don't come out just perfect for whatever reason. If you want to rip out and try again, you can. So you can see, let me center this one for you. On this one, and I haven't ironed this out real nice or anything yet, but you can see on this one that I've got a little bit of overlap one side or the other, okay? So if I just kind of move my ruler so that I have as minimal on each side as possible, still getting this 1/4 inch here, you're going to notice it, but it's going to be really, really minimal versus having one side perfect and one side really far off. Okay. And so you're just going to kind of split that difference. I could go back and resew these if I wanted to. Probably not going to worry about it being that little of an amount. And I'll just split the difference there and have about the same amount on either side. But this guy is perfect. So I'm going to lay that on there I'm going to trim up these two sides, making sure I get that seam cut. And then I can actually flip this around. And because I've already cut this side and this side, I'm going to line my flying geese ruler up with those. And you can see the other one actually, because this one also has a 4x8 flying geese on it. The line for that flying geese actually lines up really perfectly with that seam. And so you can use that as a guide to make sure that you have it on correctly. And then I can just finish trimming this up so that I've cut around all four sides. But that allows you to have an essentially perfect flying geese instead of something really wonky because you didn't oversize it. So that is all of the pieces, different pieces and parts. When you get your pinwheel done, then it's just the squares attached to that. And then you take all of those pieces that you just made and you just follow the instructions. Now, the only thing that I did different is when it talks about unit 2 and unit 3 going together, I ironed towards unit 2 instead of splitting that. I don't like to split seams like that. I know that they're trying to reduce the bulk when they do that, but it makes that seam weaker. And so I did it towards unit 2. Everything else I pretty much followed their ironing instructions for. And part of the reason why I did it to unit 2, sorry, my throat is dry, instead of unit 3 is because when you add those flying geese, this one is ironed that direction, and so it's going to help reduce your bulk that direction by doing that. Okay. So then when you get those chunks put together, then you just make a pinwheel out of it. And so again, following those instructions to get your directionality correct. And then when I ironed them together, it's the same thing as that pinwheel. Now I've got those 4 blocks. I ironed them all the same direction when I ironed these together, okay? And I actually ironed so that away from the yellow. So I went this way, okay? And then when I put this pinwheel together, again, I ironed so that all the yellow goes out. It made it lay a little bit flatter. That's just what worked for me. If you like going the other way, that's fine. That flying geese would lay a little bit flatter, but then this seam up here is going to be bulkier. And so since this seam wasn't super bulky, I wanted to reduce the bulk here. And so I went that direction. Again, with this guy, you can see that pinwheel in the back. And so instead of doing all of this to one side and having a lot of bulk here, if you go one direction, pop a couple of stitches right there, then it's gonna lay nice and flat, create that pinwheel look in that square on the back. And then that seam is gonna lay a lot flatter for you when you do that. And then it's just a matter of putting it all together and adding your borders. That's pretty easy. When you add your borders, make sure that you pin the middles, like find the middle of your piece, find the middle of your border, pin the middles, pin the end, and that's gonna decrease wonkiness. It's gonna decrease your problem of, a lot of people will have problems with their borders extending out. So you've got this 1/4 or 1/2 inch that it's like, well, it should have been perfect, right? If you have a little bit of extra, that eases it in and it will actually make your piece straighter and more square if you do that. Now, if you measure your centerpiece before you put your borders on and you're really far off of your measurement, and you need to adjust your borders, take the average of your length and cut your border to that average so that you don't have one side that's really short and one side that's a lot longer. You'll end up with a trapezoid and you won't be happy with it, but you can ease a little bit of that in, and then it should lay a lot flatter for you. And then again, when you add that second border, because you've got the top and the bottom borders, and then you've got the border all the way around. So hopefully that will help you with that. I'm gonna work on getting this all finished up and put together. I just got a big quilt off of my quilt machine, so I will probably, once I do a few other little cleaning projects and things like that, I'll probably get my Easter one on my quilt machine and get that quilted up quickly so that I can get that actually out for Easter. Wouldn't that be a concept, having it out when you're supposed to? At least Easter's a little later this year. It's in April, so I've still got a couple weeks before I need to get that out. And I will definitely show you guys the finished product on that one. So I'm going to work on this guy, and I'll show you the finished product on this one too. I hope this one goes well for you. Watch the video as much as you need to for help and guidance. And if you have comments, leave them on the video. I'd appreciate it. Have a great day.